So Professor He is a professor of sociology at National Taiwan University. I also found out just yesterday this additional title he has that I wrote down. He is the director of the Research Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the Ministry of Science and Technology as well, a position that he'll hold for a little while. As I was saying, he is, in my opinion, the foremost scholar of Taiwan's social movements. He's written all kinds of articles on some of the topics that I just mentioned. He has two books, one which is called Working Class Formation in Taiwan, which is a history of the labor movement and in some ways the failure of working class formation in Taiwan, which is really a wonderful book. And he has a relatively new book called Challenging Beijing's Mandate of Heaven, which is a study of the Sunflower Movement and the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong, which of course both happened in 2014. Lots of people noticed important convergences. He was the first one to write a book about it. So, and I understand that he's doing some follow-up. There's been some things that have happened in Hong Kong since then, if you haven't noticed. So in any event, I will leave it at that, and please join me in welcoming Professor Howard.
Very generous introduction. I also want to thank Amanda for the wonderful logistic support that bring me here. This is really my post-COVID trip. I'm glad I made it here. So today's topic will about Taiwan social movement. So the title is deliberately grandiose. But I'm not going to talk about 100 years. It's not possible. I have 40 to 45 minutes. Right, and afterwards that we were going to have Q&A section. Should I? Is that good for you? Okay. Let me begin with this. This is what I want to start it. So there are two contrasting views on Taiwan. Yeah, one of the view is view it from outside. That Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth. This is a cover story by Economist last May. As you can imagine, that the image presents that Taiwan being in the crosshairs, being targeted, and you can imagine that such kind of narrative only intensified after the Ukrainian war starting earlier this year. The other picture is taken from Pride Parade in Boston, June 2019. So I happened to be there, and it had took place several weeks after Taiwan passed the landmark legislation that allowed same-sex marriage. So up to 100 participants signed up for that, and Taiwan is actually. I look at the participant list. So Taiwan is the only two countries registered as a team. The other one be Irish Republic. So the second one is Taiwan. But Taiwan is entirely an effort by the young people there. So there are a lot of pride there. So to be the first Asian country to legalize same-sex marriage. So these two views, actually, I want to contrast that because Taiwan become a dangerous place, a flashpoint in the geopolitical politics actually is connected to the fact that internally it is a dynamic democracy, and somehow these two are connected. But oftentimes, if you view from outside, you only see that Taiwan is just a dangerous place. That's what I want to get started. So Taiwan being a democracy, I also want to begin with conventional wisdoms. There are a lot of explanation about that, but I want to keep it simple. Number one is the so-called modernization theory. I think a lot of you may be familiar with. We see democracy as an outcome of economic growth. So you have a strong middle class. So it is more likely the country will go democratic because their opinions are more enlightened. Okay, and look at what happened in Taiwan in the post-war era. Yes, we do have a so-called economic era, but that happened in a very harsh political situation. We have a long-time anti-community authoritarianism. And also, you look at the opposition movement that coming out in the 70s, most of the leaders are middle-class professionals, lawyers. So it seems that this kind of theory has, it can be applied to Taiwan. The other theory I want to talk about is the so-called literature on political transition that is in vogue in 1980s. So this theory look at only the interaction among political leaders. There was a prediction that if the moderate within the government, the reformer within the government, and the moderate within the opposition party can collaborate together, the transition will be much smoother. And look at what happened in Taiwan. I think there are some reality to that. So when authoritarianism began to give way in the 80s, you have Jiang Jingguo, who was the president until the early 1988, and he actually signaled his willingness to tolerate the opposition party. And then you have Li Denghui as a president for 12 years, and he was called Mr. Democracy. So you have the moderate leader who are acceptable to accepting change. And in the opposition, you have moderate dominant leadership in the leadership. But the DPP, the opposition party at that time, the ruling party right now, was formed in 1986. But during the first few years, focused on election. And they are very strong current within the party that advocate national Taiwan independence. But such kind of advocacy was put in the side before that. So you see the the theory we have pragmatic moderate leadership. But and also because it's Cornell, I really want to quote Li Denghui's speech here in 1995. It's that when about the first missile exercise. Okay, back then. But in that speech, he characterized Taiwan's democratic transition as a quiet, bloodless, and non-violent process. So I think Taiwan's experience to a certain extent fall into this characterization. If you want to compare it to South Korea, I think this is the most comparable cases. So South Korean democratization also began in the 80s, mid-80s, almost at the same time. And the previous trajectory was almost the same. You have economic growth under dictatorship, and somehow you have mass protests happening at the time. So compared to South Korea, let's focus on students. In South Korean case, there are a number of students who like protest. The students just immolate themselves. And also a lot of students being sentenced to jail. I know a lot of students at that time, like for example, Seoul National University, the whole cohort just went to jail. And also from the literature, we all know that at least 1,000 university students just quit their study and pretend they are workers and try to organize the workers. That happened in South Korea. But to the best of my knowledge, these things never happen in Taiwan. We don't have student suicide. We do have students that are arrested, detained, and beaten up by police, but no conviction. And there is no forced workers in Taiwan. So you can see the transition is not that radical, not that dramatic compared to South Korea. But here I want to address the conventional wisdom because it is not entirely wrong, but the problem with conventional wisdom is that it's just one-sided. It is not the entire truth. So I want to bring the goal here are threefold. But I want to bring the collective act. We bring in the collective act, especially students' law, the whole processes. Okay, we cannot just look at the elite. I think there are some mobilization coming from a civil society and in which students play a very important role. The number two goal is that I want to historicize Taiwan democratization. Yeah, the transition happened in the 80s, but you look at what happened in 1920s when Taiwan was still under Japan colonial rule, there was still a strive for democracy, for home rule. So actually it didn't happen just after economic growth. The number three is I want to add a geopolitical perspective here. So actually Taiwan was in the floor line of the geopolitical rivalry, and toward the later stage, you see that Taiwanese identity become a very powerful motivation among the student activists. So, okay, let me begin with what happened in the colonial era. So Taiwan had been ruled by the Japanese for 51 years. It is during this era that students really become a category of society because that emerged because the colonial government tried to implement its modern rule of Taiwan, and it needs to train people. So two schools is established at very early on. Number one is being national language school, national language here, of course, Japanese. The number two school is a medical school. These become the cradles of Taiwanese who want to pursue post-secondary education. And in these schools, actually, a lot of younger Taiwanese intellectuals got the inspiration. So you have Taipei or you have Jiangwei. And also the other group of students that play very important is that because we don't have university until 1928 in Taiwan, and it's very difficult for people who want to pursue higher education. So a number of rich families send their kid to Tokyo to attend a private university. So what happened is that in 1950, there was a Taiwan student organization in Tokyo, and they organized, they published a periodical called Taiwan Youth. That later on was transferred back to Taiwan and become the mouthpiece of the opposition movement in the 1920s. And although a string of students actually went to China, I think the most famous one is Xie Xuehou. She is the founder of Taiwan Communist Party. The party was organized in 1928 in Shanghai, just 7 years after the Chinese Communist Party. And she was Shanghai because she was a student of University of Shanghai. So you see that these student years are very important, very formative for these leaders in the 20s. So, and of course, there are external shocks because in the 1980s, you have the end of the First World War, and you had national self-determination, the so-called Wilsonian movement. So these are all the impetus behind this. So, and the second wave I want to talk about is what happened after the war. So the 1920 movement just ended because Japan transitioned to a fascist military regime. So all this campaign was put down. But what happened in Taiwan is that we all know that there's a period of misrule. The KMT took over Taiwan. There was a February 28 incident, which happened in 1947. That's the Eisenhower uprising against war, against that. And democracy and autonomy was the main goal at that time. But during that incident, there was so little involvement within the post-incident. When you look at the high school students in the central and southern Taiwan, they organized their militias, and they were actually armed uprisings. And we all know what happened after the February 28th. There was a massacre. Okay. But there was also actually a brigade that battled with the KMT government's regular army for a week. So this was a military intervention. But what is more interesting is afterwards. So before February 28 incident, the Chinese Communist Party, at that time we all know the context for Chinese Civil War, was never able to reach Taiwan. But what happened after that a massacre was that there was a work committee established in Taiwan, and one of its area of concentration is students. Because this is the Communist Party's main experience, because it's very easy to organize students in the cities. So especially two higher education institutions at that time, the National Taiwan University and the National Taiwan Normal University was the main target. So you have a lot of underground clandestine organizing at that time, and oftentimes they use the tactic of like we are reading a literature, so it's a reading society, and the literature might be like writing by Karl Marx or by Mao Zedong. So this is the way that this underground campaign try to approach to include student activists. And also in these two universities, there are a lot of student self-governing parties. So one of the strategies is to have their people elected as a president, so you can address to a broader audience of students. But what happened is that, so there are for 2 years, 47, 48, 49, there are a lot of student protests at the campus. Some of them will echo what happened in the mainland China, that students want to end the war, want to end the hunger and so on. But what happened in 1949 is that the KMT government came to know the existence of this underground network. So a lot of run-up, execution, And Ye Shenji being a graduate from the NTU's medical school, so people said that he was very gifted in medical research, but he was just using him as an example. So he was killed, he was executed for joining the party. So actually you look at the first, second, three cohort of medical school of National Taiwan University, many of them are political prisoners. So you can understand the situation. So it just right after the February 28 incident, and these intellectuals are not happy with the situation. So joining this clandestine campaign become the only way out, and that bring us to what is called, what we understand as white terror era, especially in the early 50s. So many people were arrested, even when they just did nothing except for doing society. And Li Zhenhui actually was one of these participants. But later he denied that he ever joined the Communist Party, but people say that he was part of it. So I move on to the next wave. So there have been long silence in the 50s and 60s. So what happened in the 70s is quite interesting because it's really starting with Diaoyutai dispute. So at that time, U.S. tried to want to return Okinawa, which it already occupied before the end of the war, to Japan. But according to the U.S. map, Diaoyutai or Senkaku Island in Japan, according to Japan, was part of this territory. So what happened is that students were not happy about it. This power politics that totally ignore the Republic of China's sentiments. Okay, so the students actually staged nationalistic protests. They want government to be stronger, okay, to be firmer. But it put the government in a very difficult situation because U.S. being the security guarantor of Taiwan, so that really cornered or limited the maneuver of bombing down the elite. But students just organized their events, they have collected signatures, they write articles, there even was a rally protest outside of the U.S. embassy. You have to understand that this is a high era of one party authoritarian control. But the government had to tolerate the proceeding of this rally because the students really reflect, somehow take the opportunity, and it is a legitimate sentiment. Okay. But what happened is that after the transfer of Okinawa, concluded with the US and Japan treaty assignment, and the whole issue just died down in Taiwan. Whereas it is more interesting that Diaoyutai had become an issue in overseas Taiwanese students, and also in Hong Kong. It become an issue right now in a lot of anti-Japan protests in contemporary China. But for Taiwan, it's become not an issue again. Even Diaoyutai belongs to Taiwan. Okay, if it is a Chinese story, it must belong to Taiwan first. So that was the very starting point in 1970 and 1971. But what happened is that because the students were organizing these patriotic activities, they were harassed by a lot of school administration. So a number of them began to demand political freedom or freedom of speech within the campus. So some of them even joined the opposition party. So this is kind of an outgrowth, spillover of this patriotic pro-government project and become anti-government. So it's just a small stream of it. So one of the books published last year by Xiao Aching, is a professor, is a sociology professor in Academia Sinica. He talked about the whole experience of the transition of the soul-searching journey of a young generation of intellectual, how they started with the obsession of Chinese nationalism, because it's a territorial dispute, then to a more indigenous identity. This is what he called cultural nativism. So this is a very interesting book. It's really about spiritual journey of the whole generation. So the next wave really started in 1980s, because at that time we had opposition party that is being formed, and the student protest also began first with a campus issue, like they want to elect the president directly, they want to have speech freedom, they don't want censorship anymore. And so there are coalition even among universities. So and also in the mid-80s, we have a lot of labor, environmental protests, a number of students joined them. And the high tide is the so-called Wild Lady movement in 1990. So this just taking place less than 1 year after Tiananmen. So it's kind of proceeding under the shadow of Tiananmen. Everyone don't want a Tiananmen solution at that time, but students also know that, and they will have this kind of risk consciousness. So basically, it's a 1 week occupation in central Taipei. This is Chiang Kai-shek Memorial. So thousands of students stay there for a week. The demand is for political to expedite the democratization. So Li Denghui was then a problem with his conservative within the party, but after he got elected as a president, he received a student delegate and promised that he's going to speed up the democratization. So that protest actually concluded peacefully, just 1 week. So they are going protests, but I want to show, but afterwards, there was a big protest against abortion in the 1990s, but afterward, we don't have this kind of politically oriented student activists. To a certain extent, because the society doesn't need that, and Taiwan has been on the way to democratization. We opened up an election for municipal city. We have 4 election of lawmakers, and then we have the first presidential election in 1996. So in a sense, the party is no longer in the student. Also, the student attention has been diverted to a number of issues, like ecological, gender, and LGBT issues. So for a certain period of time, we didn't find a unified voice of student activism. It's just been absent for nearly 18 years. And one of the interesting outcomes is that I want to highlight that a number of student activists, leaders at that time, become DPP politicians. And some of them become professors. Like this one, Fan Yun, who is my colleague at the Department of Sociology at National Taiwan University. She was the spokesperson during that time. And she was referred to as Taiwan's Cai because it was, you have to understand that the protest proceeded under the shadow of Tiananmen. And this is what he is right now. He's a lawmaker of the ruling party since year 2020. But he has been, before that, he went to Yale. Well, he got a PhD in year 2000. Then he began his her teaching career, and she was active among feminist organization. So she became a politician only after year 2020. So you can see the career trajectory to see basically a lot of wildly activists or leaders follow this kind of trajectory. So as I indicated before, there was an 18 years absence in which there are protests joined by students, but it didn't catch the national attention until the year 2008. And this is a tremendous change because it was a year that the KMT made a comeback, and Ming-sho became the president again. He won a re-election in 2012, so he stayed there in power for 8 years. And during this 8 years, you see the intensified mobilization from civil society, the number of protests, and student movement also was kind of reawakened at that period. And this had to put into the context in a number of global development that is not only unique to Taiwan. The number one is the rise of digitally enabled activism. So we have social media, and we now know that during the Arab Spring in 2010 to 2011, Facebook, Twitter played a very important role to spread out, disseminate the images. To a certain extent, Taiwan was part of that, the global trend. The second global trend that also you can find in Taiwan is the increasing voice and discontent among young people. You have discussion of young people falling into the precariat position. So they were less able to get a full-time job, a decent full-time job. They were overeducated. So they complained about that. So that was also the driving force of the Occupy Wall Street. So to a certain extent, Taiwan's youth share that discontent. And number three being China factor. So increasingly, prior to year 2000, even though there was a military exercise when Taiwan had the first presidential election back in 1996, but Taiwan was never failed internally in Taiwan. But after Ming-sho became the president and Ming-sho elected on agenda to build a closer relationship with mainland China, you really see a presence of China factor in Taiwan. So two important student movements actually reflect that. The first one is the so-called wild strawberry movement in 2008 that took place because Ming-sho government was receiving an envoy from PRC, and this is the first time. So there was strict policing on the street. Many protesters were brutally treated. So students come to protest about the human rights violation. So this is really make the rebirth of student movement. And Wildberry, why is that name? Because at that time, the student would be, young people were generally referred to as generation of strawberry or strawberry tribe, meaning that they are just good looking, but they're not sturdy. Okay, and they put a wild there. So it's kind of an ironical mockery. The second incident took place in 2012. The movie is called Anti-Media Monopoly because there was a media tycoon who was a Taiwanese merchant, actually became his huge successful enterprise in China. And in year 2000, he went back to Taiwan to buy a lot of media outlets, newspaper, TV, and so on. And at that time, he wanted to expand his control to cable TV. So there were criticism because this guy just said that, for example, like he said, no people were dead in Tiananmen incident. So it's like he just echoed this kind of Tiananmen denial. Okay, but he's that guy. And so when he tried to expand his media control, so there were protests. So that was also students involved. You see the logo there. So again, so Taiwan, as I mentioned, there was China factor here. I think it's after 2018 that you have this term sharp power. But actually look back in Taiwan, what happened in this century. So a lot of effort you can characterize as sharp power, except that it was before the invention of this term. So China tried to intervene in Taiwan, but the missile test was a failure. Li Denghui was re-elected with more than half of the votes. So what he tried to do instead to use an indirect strategy, what I call economic united front strategy, meaning that he tried to, like for example, use the Taiwanese merchant in China as leverage to influence Taiwan's politics. Or like for example, he tried to give economic favor to certain agricultural producers based in Taiwan, like fruit farmers. So they have this privileged access to Chinese market. So they become reliant on China. So they try to emphasize, to implement this kind of economic statecraft in Taiwan, and also fostering pro-Beijing media, like the media anti-media monopoly being one. So a lot of coordinated information campaigns. So you see actually Taiwan was, for us, so back in 1995, 96, China was just a missile outside of that. But 20 years later, you feel a presence almost in every people's daily life. So as I said, this period's youth movement or student movement were really driven by economic growth. So there are some economic background there. So we have higher youth unemployment. Also, actually, look at the data. We have a wage stagnation from year 2000 to 2014. So 15 years, the real wage doesn't grow. At the same time, you know the real estate price and commodity price rising. So you see the young people complain really have a solid basis. So also gone was the era, like in the 70s, in the 80s, we have this so-called transition from factory hand to both. Because that time Taiwan was still a manufacturing hub. So a lot of opportunity for people to get into entrepreneurship. So that was a golden era. But afterwards, we have concentration of business. So it's very difficult for young people to become their own boss. So you have this kind of complaint and disillusion. And so the Sunflower movement I'm going to talk about in a minute happened in 2014 was really about a core issue of the Ming-sho's government agenda at that time. That was about economic integration with China, into China. So it is interesting to look at what DPP, the opposition party at that time, the opposition party actually tried to oppose that in year 2008 and year 2012. But after he lost the election second time, so he tried to become more centrist when it comes to the mainland policy. The DPP never said no to this free trade agreement, which I will mention. It's called Cross-Strait Service Trade Agreement, 服贸协定. So this is really the centerpiece of Ming-sho's effort to build closer relationship with China. So a number of industry in Taiwan will be opened up for investment and manpower migration coming from China. So the whole process actually was conducted with little announcement. So when it was signed in June 2013, so it just 1 week before that, and the newspaper people began to report it, but none of the people related, impacted industry had been consulted. So it was being criticized as a black box. So because of the sweeping scope of this liberalization, but so little input from the public opinions. What happened is that, so after the signing of the agreement, there was a bipartisan agreement in the legislature that this agreement has to be reviewed article by article. And there have to be some public hearing. But what happened is that when it comes to March 17, 2014, the ruling party lawmaker just tried to push the bill to the second reading. So it's very chaotic. Just 30 minutes or the bill was passed. So what happened is that the people were surprised because it violated the previous agreement to review that agreement article by article. They just done it in the package within 30 minutes. So this is what happened. So 1 day later, the student just rushed into the legislature and unexpectedly evolved into a 24 days of occupation of the legislature. So it terrorized our lawmaking organs. So in the end, they eventually evacuate the legislature peacefully, voluntarily, even claimed the victory because there was a split within the ruling party at the time. And that became a very important turning point of Taiwan's party because the ruling party was so humiliated. And you might think this kind of very radical, unusual acts might incur public opposition, but the fact was no, actually, the majority of people supported that. So you look at the poll at that time. So it's so you see the KMT's electoral fortune in 2014 and 2016 onward have been reversed. So this is, I think, is a very important turning point for Taiwan. And this is a recreation of what happened before. And that this is a defied. So all the occupation, the students just occupy this building. But on the street, you have people come there. So this has become a protest zone for 24 days. And this is Taipei Railroad Station here. But actually, it's a political crisis ongoing. But if you leave this area, you go to Taipei Railroad Station, you find the society just went on as usual. There was nothing there. You won't barely notice that if you didn't come here. But this was the situation. And as I said, there were generation roots there. So it's very difficult to characterize that as a student movement because there was a poll conducted at a protest site that around 3/4 of the participants were actually below 30. And surprisingly, only 1/4 of the participants were identifying themselves as students. So more than 84% of the participants had university degree or above. So it really fits the profile of highly educated young people, but not necessarily them are students. So it is a picture layer, so a lot of creative work being there, a lot of even fans of electronic music were there. So it's, as you can imagine, it's a worldwide trend for this kind of Occupy protest. We try to be inclusive, welcome everybody, perform that. So a lot of artist work being done there. And this is afterwards, because there are so many artistic work. So before the conclusion of the protest, there are efforts to collect these items. So it eventually become online archive. The website is here. You can just register and get access to this archive to access this data. All these objects are being curated, classified, and given this description. So what I do here is studies that I look at the writing. So this writing refers to people who write a postcard, a letter to a student in the occupied legislature, and somehow miraculously, our mailing system still works even during the political crisis. So a lot of paperwork letters were sent to them, and then they duly collected them and donate to this collection. So we have more than 44,000 pieces, and a number of them were sent from abroad, from Japan, from Hong Kong, and so on. So it's very interesting. So this is one piece, just a sample. It's a postcard, but the writer tries to group the letters in the shape of Taiwan. So what I do here is that I look at the message, and so this is a microcosm of the supporters outside. So look at the value they mention when they try to justify this movement. So you see the distribution. This is almost 60% of the writing mentioned democracy. That we are here to fight for democracy. We don't want dictatorship. We want rule of law. We want dual procedure. We don't want black box, so on. The number two is mentioned, what I call nationalism, Taiwanese nationalism. So for example, like, I love Taiwan. I don't want Taiwan to be part of China. We should resist economic regression of China and so on. So these are 59 and 52%. And for the rest, I mentioned the principle of nonviolence, generational justice, and opposition to free trade are so few. So what I try to emphasize here is that in the mindset of the supporter, I think the two dominant values there, democracy and nationalism. This is without doubt. So there are aftermaths. So Hong Kong's umbrella movement took place in the same year in September, indirectly inspired by Taiwan's example, because there was a talk about occupy the central with love and peace. But it's been going on for more than 1 year, and suddenly you have a student occupied movement going on. So kind of radicalize Hong Kong students, and one thing leads to another. You have, and also in case of Taiwan, we have newer protests in gender, that big anti-nuclear protests there just 3 weeks afterwards. So that actually forced the pro-nuclear KMT government to stop the construction of the fourth nuclear power plant project. And if you knew Taiwan, this nuclear power plant has been in controversy for more than 30 years. And no one ever imagined before that this project would be shut down by a Kuomintang president. So this is a very unimaginable scenario. And also next year, we have high school student protest against the curriculum change, and it was stopped as high school students of from. They also try to occupy the Ministry of Education. And also, what is the other interesting is that you might think these protesters are they have so low faith of democratic institution. That's the whole reason why they occupy the law legislature in the first place. But actually, no. Many of them just occupy the legislature, and then they run for the lawmaker, the legislature position. So it's from a smooth transition from occupying to electioneering. So we have new parties forming afterward. In the election of 2016, you have New Power Party that got 5 seats out of 113. So it was the third largest party at that time. It remained its presidency after 2020, although it seats are fewer. And we have a pro-independent party used to be there in year 2000. And also look at, this is a central level. If you look at the local level, like the case I want to refer to is the 2018 local election. So in the local council, we have around 900 local councilors, 县市议员 in Taiwan. And so a lot of young people, for young people, it's more accessible because you don't have get that much more. So we have, by my account, 93 movement party candidates. A lot of movement parties just emerged afterwards, and 20 of them were elected. And also we have a lot of ex-sunflower activists now join the government because the DPP became the ruling party after 2016. So I have students who were working with the in the presidential office, in the party central office, in executive yuan, in various ministries. So these people actually got this opportunity to work as aides or secretary or other assistant job in the government. So it's very interesting to watch their career path. So I want to, so I have to talk about the different waves of student movement. So I want to do some comparison to wrap up my presentation. So I think back to the very early beginning of the post-war era, I think the Kennedy regime is very, very exceptional because learning from its setback in the Manhattan period, it knew that the campus projects can be dangerous. That's why from very early on, there was widespread surveillance system being implemented. So that's why the campus had been quiet for a very, very long time. So we have control system, we have military instructors in every school, we have like spy system. And the other thing I want to mention is that Taiwan being a Chinese society, so there was a cultural script for students. I think the most referred to embodiment of that is what happened in 1990, the May 4th movement. So it was a student patriotic movement. So students being the conscience of the society, they have this kind of moral authority. They can address to the ruler to ask them to address their wrongdoing. So they got this moral power, and people look up to them. And this is kind of a heritage. So what happened is that in different waves of Taiwan's student movement, especially when it comes to the 2014 Sunflower movement, you see the kind of cultural spirit has been diluted. It's more like a youth movement instead of student. And there are a number of reasons for that. And also one of the most significant changes is that during 1990 Wild Strawberry movement, we do have students who carry out hunger strike, as you see that in Tiananmen. But after in year 2008, 2014, no one ever tried to do that. Because the hunger strike is a kind of a tactic that a certain people, student, because they have this kind of standing. So when they willingly take this suicide-like protest, it really carry about a very important moral power against the regime. But still no longer doing that. They were doing that in 1990, but no longer have to. So this is one sign. And also I want to mention that, so even I try to talk about 100 years, but actually their student movement just limited to a certain period of time. So you see the intermittent pattern. So there are huge historical discontinuity in Taiwan. So the Japanese era was little referred to when there were students organizing themselves in the post-war era. And also, like for example, in the 80s, students no longer refer to the Diaoyutai incidents. And also, there was a 18 years absence between Wild Lady movement and Wild Strawberry movement. So you have this kind of discontinuities. And also, you put it in a longer historical terms. I think the ideology change is the most interesting. So in the late 40s, you have communist clandestine campaign. So the ideology is revolutionary socialism. Then in the 70s, you have Diaoyutai incident, so it's Chinese nationalism. Now you have democracy, or you can put Taiwanese nationalism there. So you have the wholesale change of ideological mindset. And also, I want to mention that even though we have different periods of the movement, but most of the time it's just very moderate. Even during the underground organizing of the Chinese Communist Party, because none of them are armed. They don't carry out some insurgent activities. So it's very moderate. Also in nationalization, as I said, the Taiwanese identity is really a late emergence. And the reason why I said that there was a dilution of the cultural script of student projects, because I think it really referred to the fundamental change of education system in Taiwan. It used to be an elite education, so it's very difficult to get into the college. But over a year, we have expansion, actually over-expansion of university. So the university has become more like a mass education. So you see the student movement mentioning the economic grievance in 2014, but it was not so before even you didn't see the talk about economic issue during 1990. And also that reflects the erosion of student privilege. And also there was a discussion of student status of being a kind of a waithood, because even in my school, like more and more people, undergraduate, cannot finish their degree within 4 years. Many voluntarily choose to stay in undergraduate study for 5 years, 6 years. But one of the reasons is that they don't want to jump. They don't want to be pushed into a job market. So they prefer, like, they want to have more choice. So, and I think that reflects in Taiwan. So one of the interesting is that during the 2014 Sunflower movement, most of the leaders are graduate students. But normally you don't expect graduate students to involve in this situation. So that time, like for example, in favor is a graduate student. But back in 1990, all the leaders are undergraduate students, including finance. So the expression, the cultural expression, especially the heavy reliance on the memes, on internet, slogan, and so on. So I think you can say that there was a blurring of student and non-student distinction. So also I want to mention that all the four waves in the post-war era reflect certain political context, but I didn't mention that. So the first war was the context after the February 28 incident. And the 70s, the Diaoyutai incident happens at a time when there was an internal succession crisis within the Kuomintang government, because Chiang Kai-shek was ill, and his son was trying to take over the control, and he had to appear more liberal. So some dissidents were tolerated until he consolidated his power. So you have in the mid-80s, that's marked the real transition, the end of the martial law that had been in place in Taiwan for more than 38 years. And also the last wave from wild lily, wild strawberry movement to the sunflower movement really reflect the return to power. And so we have legacy, both negative and positive. The white terror, basically you can say that it's a failed student movement. And that have wild-lasting legacy. So for generations, parents have told their kids to stay away from public affairs. Don't get involved in certain dubious reading society, because that can be lethal. And don't get into politics, just try to be a doctor, to be engineers. Okay, that has been a mindset for many years, for many decades. So political aversion has been a dominant political culture. But there are also positive legacy. I think especially for a wild lady movement, it just happened in 1 week. And President Lee Teng-hui received the student delegate, and then everyone was gone. So it became a positive lesson when follow-up student activity can evolve. So this is also a positive lesson. So what I want to say is that still mobilization throughout the past century of Taiwan is very short-lived. It's just episodic. But it was during this episodic mobilization, I think important change, consequential change took place in Taiwan. And student movement cannot last forever. One of the reasons is that student status has been transitional. No one is going to be a student forever. Okay. And also, I think what is interesting or challenging for student of social movement is that certain results are always easier to observe. Okay, but how about long-term effects? So one of the examples I just mentioned, that for example, wild lady generation, many of them become professor. So they kind of coach another generation of protests when it emerged in year 2008. Okay, and there was also the final thought is that the so-called long march to institutions, that was a saying from French student movement in the early 60s. So really, the challenge is really how do you change the society, change the street, through institutional method. So right now we have like wild lady generated in the 50s and sunflower movement generated in the 30s. Many of them are in the government. So one of the things I think we can observe is that whether these ex-activists are going to change the party as we know it, or are they going to be assimilated into a political culture, a way of doing politics that nobody really likes. So this is, I think, what we will be to be observed in the year to come. So I end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much.